Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Ven Señor Jesús, Maranatha. Si ven pronto, Maranatha.
I need to take a short break. When we return, Professor Roy Schoeman will be joining us. We can continue this conversation, too. We can talk a little bit about the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. And I was stunned by one number. I saw data earlier today showing a 337% increase in anti-Semitic incidences between October and December of 2023. That's just a couple months ago. We'll talk about that. Also, Passover begins tonight. What do you know about Passover? I'll fill you in. We'll talk about that and more right after this.
Your news, The Drew Mariani Show on Relevant Radio. Your news now.
In later Jewish tradition, the Passover was viewed as a special kind of memorial, a special kind of remembrance. Because once Israel got into the Holy Land, once they were living in the land, they would keep celebrating the Passover every year, but time passed, right? Generations went by. Moses, for example, is around the 15th century before Christ. So they're living in the land for centuries, over 1,000 years before you get to Jesus' time. And every year when they're celebrating that Passover, they came to recognize that when we do this memorial of the Passover, we're not just like saying, hey, remember what God did way back when for our ancestors? The Jews had a tradition that whenever you kept the Passover, that in a certain sense, you went back in time to that original night.
The Drew Mariani Show on Relevant Radio.
Yeah, so Passover begins at sundown today, I believe. So I want to talk a little bit about it. What do you know about it? We're going to do a 101 on it. You know, there's our own Eucharist. There's a strong Catholic connection there. But before I do that, I was just on this anti-Semitism issue, and I've invited Professor Roy Schoeman, who's been a great contributor to this program over the years. He's an adjunct professor of theology at Ave Maria University, and he's actually a convert. He's also he teaches at Holy Apostle Seminary, but he was a Jew. He had a profound experience that brought a radical conversion in his life. He's written numerous books, and I'll get you connected to his website. And I was talking to him during the break because, you know, I look at what's unfolding in this country with all of this anti-Semitism, and it disturbs me. In recent years, we have witnessed a significant rise in anti-Semitism, marked by also an increase in hateful incidences, right? That a lot of those within the Jewish community are concerned for their own safety. This is the United States of America. Somebody should not be afraid because of their faith, their religion, the color of their skin, for their safety. And this trend has been particularly pronounced, you know, following these geopolitical tensions that we're seeing in the Middle East, this Israeli-Hamas war. And what Hamas did was terrible. Israel wants to eradicate them. We've seen a lot of collateral damage there. But as I was sharing, in just a short span of months between the attack on October 7th and the end of the year, 337% increase in anti-Semitic instances. And the spike is it's part of a broader trend that has seen a steady rise right now. We're seeing protests on college campuses and a whole litany of other things. Professor Schoeman, good to have you with me today. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for the invitation. Love to be here.
Protests and university campuses, that's nothing new. Fill me in on your perspective on this as a former Jew, as a Catholic, as a professor. What are the origins of this, and how do you respond?
First of all, there's a lot of good, high quality information that's gone public if one knows where to look for it. And for instance, Iran has a very active government agency for controlling public opinion. And Iran has been orchestrating through the Muslim student organizations and through the, Muslim social organizations in this country and in Europe, a lot of the current uprising on college campuses against Israel. It's not a genuinely grassroots event. And we have the receipts. I mean, we have the documentation from, I forgot the name of the Iranian bureau that handles it. And we also know, we have literally the receipts, that Hamas was funded directly by the Iranian government to the tune of over 200 million British pounds, so about $250 million. And the New York Times, which is not a wildly pro-Israel publication, actually published a photocopy of the accounting sheet of the contributions, the money funneled to Hamas from Iran over about 7 years to fund their operations. This is a once in a millennium chance for in the Middle East to eradicate the Jewish presence from Israel. And these are not unsophisticated actors, and they're using their tentacles all over the world.
Yeah. Let's grab a call or two for you. Father Malik joins us. He's listening in Palos Heights, Illinois. Hi, Father. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Drew, and to your guest, Roy. Professor Roy, let me just begin by wishing our Jewish brothers and sisters a most blessed and holy Passover season. Drew, I wanted to make a comment. I grew up in Jordan, and I lived across the street from a Palestinian refugee camp. And I had friends who lived there. I, walked around their neighborhoods. The root cause of this issue of anti-Semitism is not being addressed. The concept of Zionism, which is the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Palestine,
right.
Historic Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that land is called Palestine historically. And that's why you hear sometimes the chants from the river to the sea. But the consequence of the creation of the state of Israel has caused hundreds of thousands of families to be removed from their home in Palestine.
Right.
My friends who lived in that refugee camp still had the keys and the deeds to their homes in Palestine.
Yeah.
And nobody is addressing that issue. So unless we remove the root cause of the Palestinian refugee problem, and for the Palestinians to return back to their homes, the issue of anti-Semitism is never going to go away, as long as we are ignoring that basic issue of the rights. And a lot of them are Christians, by the way. The Catholic Church, the Latin Patriarch in Jerusalem, is being ignored totally for his call for the end of the occupation. And just one last comment.
Sure.
This concept of Hamas. That's an Arabic acronym which means resistance. It's a resistance movement. So what are they resisting? They're resisting occupation. So unless the occupation ends, the resistance will never end, whether you call it Hamas or something else. Mm-hmm. So there will always be a resistance against occupation. Yeah. And really, that's my only comment. As a priest, I pray for peace all the time, but I personally experienced the agonies of these Palestinian refugees, and nobody is addressing their issue. The Congress just passed a resolution to send more weapons to Israel. Well, where is the logic in that? Where they're killing, there's now 34,000 people, even if you disagree with that number, or you don't, even if it's even close, or even if it's half of it.
Right.
How can we tolerate such genocide? We are pro-life, which means from womb to tomb, conception to natural death. This is not natural.
Amen.
And thank you for allowing me to speak my mind. Let us continue to pray for peace in Palestine, for the Israelis and the Arabs and everybody else there. And I'll hang up so I can listen to the professor's comments and yours as well, Drew.
Father, you're welcome. You are welcome anytime. Love your perspective. I'm grateful for it. And Professor, I'll let you respond to Father Malik's comments.
I think the only thing that I can agree with him on is let's pray for peace. I understand that he's from Jordan originally. I also understand that his understanding of the history, let's say, is incorrect. For instance, I don't want to spend an hour on this really, but for instance, there were Jews continuously in that territory, in that area, in Palestine, since basically since the destruction of the temple. Palestine was not a nation. Palestine was the territory. It was the geographic area, like Brooklyn or something, And if you look at a newspaper from the 1930s, you'll see stories about Jewish Palestinians and Muslim Palestinians and Christian Palestinians. Palestinian was not an ethnic identity. It was a geographic location. So to say that because it was called Palestine, it means that the current Arab inhabitants who call themselves Palestinians were the original inhabitants. It's just not true. And we have pilgrim reports. We have demographics and so forth from the 16th century, from the 17th century, from the 15th century. The majority population was not Muslim, and for many of those centuries, the majority population was Jewish, although there were, as a matter of fact, the number 2 population is Christian. So this is just, but I understand that now that we're in, whatever it is, 70 years after the founding of the State of Israel, we have 2 or 3 generations of those, very maligned natives that have been falsely catechized.
All right, Professor, I am grateful for your time, your perspective. Father, I am for you as well. I need to take a short pause here. When we come back, this is an issue that I know we can fiercely debate. A lot of people are passionate about it. I want to talk Passover, too, because I have a few moments on the other side and give people a little bit of a history perspective on that and to understand what our Jewish brothers and sisters will be engaging in this evening and for the next several days. That conversation and more continues right after this.
When does he choose to go down to Jerusalem? At Passover. And there's a reason. He, of course, knows the scriptures, right? But as a Jew, he's going to fulfill even their traditions about the fact that the Messiah was going to come on Passover night. And he's going to die just like the Passover lamb died. And the New Testament is really clear that that's what's going on. If you look there, the new Passover of Christ, St. Paul actually tells us, Christ, our Passover lamb, and the Greek word there is Pascha, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us do what? Keep the feast.
The Drew Mariani Show on Relevant Radio.
So let's talk Passover. I don't know how much you know about it, whether you are plugged into what your Jewish brothers and sisters will be celebrating. I thought it would be a great 101 for you and me to better understand the origins, the traditions, the connection to the Eucharist, the history of Passover. And it is, unquestionably one of the most significant religious festivals in the Jewish calendar, and it commemorates the exodus of the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt. As you read in the Bible, particularly the book of Exodus. And, of course, the Israelites were enslaved by the Pharaoh, prompting God to send Moses. He delivered the people. Pharaoh refused Moses' plea to free the Israelites. God inflicted the 10 plagues on Egypt. We know the story, right? And the last being the death of the Egyptians' firstborn. And then the Israelites smeared the blood of a sacrificed lamb on their doorposts as a sign for the angel of death to pass over their homes and spare the firstborn. And, how was this first Passover observed? How long is it? And what do we need to know? I'm joined by Professor Roy Schoeman today to break it all down for us. Professor, take us back in time and unpack it all if you could. Give us a 101.
Okay. And I do want to underline the Christological significance of Passover because boy, it's front and center everywhere you look. So as you said in your intro, Passover is a celebration of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. They were slaves there. And then God raised up a redeemer for them, Moses, and who miraculously, through God's intervention, got their freedom. And when they were free, well, I'll just say very quickly, so I think you mentioned it, but God enabled Moses to perform a bunch of miracles trying to get the Pharaoh to let them go. He finally did let them go, but as soon as they left, Pharaoh changed his mind, sent the army after them. They were trapped at the borders, the side of the Red Sea. God arranged the a foundational miracle of Judaism, which was to separate the waters of the Red Sea and let the Jews cross dry shod across the seabed, and then when the Egyptian army tried to follow, the sea flowed back and it drowned all of them. But then the Israelis or the Jews were in the desert, and they had a crossed the desert, and they spent 40 years in the desert, and they didn't have very much food with them. So God provided them the miraculous bread from heaven, the manna, to sustain them in the desert until they got to what for them was the promised land, which was Israel. Moses in Judaism is known as the first Redeemer, and because of the story of Exodus, the Jewish theology makes it very clear that Moses was a prefigurement of the Messiah to come, and the Messiah is going to be the ultimate Redeemer, and therefore when the Messiah comes, he has to come on Passover, since he's the fulfillment of the picture in advance, which was Moses and the Exodus from Egypt, which is exactly why, by the way, that the crucifixion had to take place on Passover, because it was the fulfillment of the promise of Passover. And of course, everyone involved in the Last Supper was a Jew, so they also knew that the fulfillment of the promise would have to be on Passover. Now, from a Christian perspective, the Christology is painfully evident, and it was from the first centuries of the church. The Jews' slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt is a picture of mankind's slavery to the power of Satan. Pharaoh was a picture of Satan. The Jews were freed from the power of Pharaoh by crossing through the waters of the Red Sea. That's a picture of the Christian being freed from the power of Satan by passing through the waters of baptism, which really literally happens, as you know, that the Christian is freed from the power of Satan. The Jews wandering through the desert for 40 years is a picture of us, and especially the Christians, wandering through the desert of this life for 40 years on their way to the heavenly Jerusalem rather than the earthly Jerusalem, the true Jerusalem, so to speak. But the Jews in the desert needed a miraculous sustenance in their wandering through the desert, which was the manna, the miraculous bread from heaven, which of course is a picture of the Eucharist, the true miraculous bread from heaven, which sustains the Christian in their wandering through this life, so to speak, on the way to heaven. And Jesus himself in John 6 makes the comparison very, very overt. He says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, but they died nonetheless. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh. So everything about Passover is Christological.
My guest today, Professor Roy Schoeman. We're taking a look at Passover and everything that you need to know about it. How long does it last, Professor? The Seder the Seder meal as well. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on the context of that in terms of the Eucharist.
Well, the heart of that is, of course, that the Last Supper was a Seder meal. And the Last Supper was simultaneously, one could say, the last sacramental Seder meal and the first sacramental Catholic Mass. So one can very easily see the Last Supper as the single point in time when the Old Covenant and the Jewish sacramental system was transformed into the New Covenant and the Catholic sacramental system. And in fact, the reason why the host is unleavened bread in the Roman Church is precisely because at the Last Supper, it was matzah. It was the ceremonial bread that is used throughout Passover as a remembrance of the Jews not being able to let their bread rise before they fled into the desert. The Passover is a week long, 7 or 8 days, depending on where you are. If you're in Israel, it's 7 days. If you're out of Israel, it's 8 days. They do that. It's a long story, so I'll leave that aside for now. It begins with the Passover Seder meal, which is a ritual meal with a lot of ritual foods, which are symbolic of the slavery in Egypt and the liberation from the slavery in Egypt. And it is around not everyone has to eat lamb, but it is a memorial of the very first Passover, which was the night in Egypt when the last miracle that Moses performed for the Pharaoh that got him to finally let the Jews leave was the slaying of the firstborn, where the angel of death came through Egypt and slayed the firstborn in every house of every animal and of every person. And for the Jews not to have their firstborn killed, they were told to slaughter a spring lamb and daub the blood of the lamb on the doorposts on their houses, and that would tell the angel of death to pass over and not slay their firstborn. That's why it's called Passover. And if you just look at that, just think of it. We know that Jesus was the true Passover lamb, and it was his blood on the cross which saved us, caused the angel of death, so to speak, to pass over us. And if you think of the houses in Egypt, the only wood, I mean, the lintel and the doorpost, which is what the Bible says where they had to daub the blood, would be the crossed wood at the doorpost of the house.
Wow. Let me do this. We only have a couple minutes. I'm going to grab a couple of phone calls for you. Greg is in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Hi, Greg.
Yes, I'm curious about, I know that the Christ's bones were not broken, and there's scriptural references to that, but in my investigations, I found out that it was also prohibited to break the bones of the Paschal lamb at the original Passover. And I was wondering if there was any explanation as to what this means.
All right, great.
No, well, I don't know whether there is any explanation. I don't know an explanation of why God did the commandment. It's in Exodus chapter 12, verse 43, quote, "And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is an ordinance of the Passover. You shall not break a bone of it." So we know that it was an explicit command by God that was immortalized in the Torah, in the Old Testament. Why God didn't want any bones of it to be broken, I don't know, but it's not hard to how can I put it? If you just have the imagination that every Passover lamb was a picture of Jesus to come, then you can start thinking that perhaps there was some kind of reverence or symbolic respect that was shown by that.
Yeah. Professor, I only have a moment or two left. I know we have a lot of phone calls here. I'm about to pray the chaplet of Divine Mercy, but I do want to get people connected to you and to your story. I know your website is salvationisfromthejews.com, and people can pick up your books. You got a great conversion story, and I'll tell you, it's well worth it. But your YouTube channel, people want to check that out. That's Jewish Catholic. What will they find there? I don't think I've ever checked it out. I still have to do that.
Yeah, it's Jewish Catholic, all in one word. I tell every day, pretty much. I mean, at least five or six times a week. I have actually at 3:00 Eastern. I have a Divine Mercy chaplet followed by a short talk. Sometimes it's very short. Sometimes it's not so short. And I also have hundreds of teaching videos on my channel. Everything's for free, of course. But the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church. And just various aspects of Catholic spirituality, very often with a little Jewish light shown on it.
Cool. YouTube channel, Jewish Catholic, all one word. salvationisfromthejews.com, and we'll bring Professor Shulman back again. He's always a lot of fun to talk to. Professor, thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Gloria laus et honor tibi sit, Rex Christe Redemptor, cui puerile decus, prompsito sana pium, Israel est tu Rex, Davidis et inclita proles, nomine qui in Domini, Rex benedicte venis, cetus in excelsis, te laudat celicus omnis, et mortalis homo, et cuncta creata simul. Gloria laus et honor tibi sit, Rex Christe Redemptor, cui puerile decus, prompsito Hosanna.